What a Wild Spirit Brings by Lil, Chapter 28. She arrived at a small mining town late in the evening, and hid to observe the villagers meandering about the lodge-like buildings that lined the lone street leading to a barge along the river. She was surprised to find the people all had the same accents as Munchin and his wife live. How could the Andari people speak so clearly, and the mountain folks speak like this? They were all the same people, weren't they? She tried to avoid people, since she was still Entha in appearance, but she needed to cross the river, and the huge barge strung to long wires that led to the other side called to her. It was snowing again, and the swim in this cold might freeze her to death. She took a deep breath and dove through the town. Miners and housewives alike started shouting and throwing things at her. Some people ran into their homes screaming about sandwiches, and some were grabbing up picks and axes and chasing after her. Even a few women were running with ladles and rolling pins. She was quick, though, and stayed ahead of the mob. She dodged carts and leapt out of reach of snarling dogs. She had to get past these country bumpkins to the barge. If she had to try to pull herself across alone, she would. It amused her for a moment that she could think of them like she did when she had once been not so far different from them. She had to reach her brother. She had to get to Yedem. They could shout and holler and chase her all they wanted through the muddy road, but she would get to him and earn her honor back. She was almost to the barge when two huge men with cudgels stopped in front of it, patting the weapons on their hands, palms up. They were probably just hired guards, but she still frowned. The mob was dangerous only because of ignorance. Once they discovered she was Andri, she would be fine. These two, they wouldn't care where she was from, only that she couldn't use the barge without paying. Lil did something completely rash. She turned from the barge and dove toward the mob. The people's eyes were wide and flashing, their voices united in 100 curses. Their arms were in the air, brandishing makeshift weapons. She stood for a few moments, then dove away again, just out of their reach. One trip, one false move, and they would catch her and tear her apart before she could even show herself their kind. But she led the mob back and forth, always just out of catching, until she dashed suddenly toward the two men. They had been willing to fight alone Entha, but a whole town of people without their wits was another thing. They scrambled to get out of the way, and Lil jumped onto the barge and climbed up to the wire. She started pulling herself along it, leaving the mob screaming and shouting for someone to push the barge after her. Large as it was, it couldn't handle the strain of so many people all jumping up and down on it, and more of the mob just kept piling on. Lil glanced back and saw a fat man, who must be the barge master, trying to shout louder than the people to no avail. The whole vessel began to snap and sink, and the townsfolk were now fighting each other to get off and back to land, using the makeshift weapons, previously intended for her, to catch sinking boards and planks, and the dock as best they could, so as not to be dumped into the icy waters. Lil felt bad for them. She hadn't meant to cause that huge of a riot, nor cost the poor fat man, who was now on his knees staring at his sinking barge in disbelief, such trouble. She would have to figure out some way to pay them back somehow. She kept pulling herself along the wire, her knees wrapped around it, her hands hauling. She was almost to the other side when the wire began to sag. The townspeople must be cutting it and trying to drown her. She tried to hurry. She pulled and pulled, but the wire was going down quickly. Lil gasped in pure shock from the wash of cold over her when it fell entirely. She struggled to think. She screamed from the chill. The cold made her want to sink, to stop, to curl into herself and just die. Her mind was numb as her limbs, but she fought with all her stubbornness in her to reach the nearby shore. The current was strong and was pulling herself, but she knew she could make it if she could just keep kicking her legs. She couldn't even feel if she was or not, but she fought to. She was gradually getting nearer, so she had to be. She could hear splashing of her arms flailing and knew she was making it dimly. It took what seemed all night to make it, but when she reached the shore she was so cold she couldn't even move. She needed help. She didn't know how to find any. She felt weak and tired. She failed. She was going to die. She would never regain her honor. She failed her mother. Ties. Ties! Lil suddenly had strength. She couldn't move for herself, but she could for her mother. The book was soaked. Her mother's picture. She started dragging herself up to her feet. She wobbled and stayed up. She put all her focus on each slow step to save her mother's picture. She had to. She saw lights of the house not far off and kept moving toward it. Light meant fire. Light meant drawing the picture. She had to save Mother's portrait. She finally made it to the house's fence, and knew vaguely that a dog was barking. The door opened to the building, and out came an elderly woman. She was talking, but Lil couldn't understand her. It was as if everything were in a haze. She slowly pulled out the book and tried to say to save it, but the effort made her collapse.